The awakening of Devil Fruits is easily one of the wildest, most mysterious, and most fascinating power-ups in all of One Piece. How do you actually unlock it? What do all these awakenings have in common? And most importantly, which ones have we already seen in action? Today, we're going through every Devil Fruit awakening we've seen so far in One Piece. But we're starting with the craziest one of them all. Because yeah, we're opening with him. The fruit that completely broke the fandom. The Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika. And let's be real right away. The idea behind this awakening is just genius. Because in a manga like One Piece, where comedy has always been a core part of the story, Oda came up with a power-up that feels like the perfect fusion of pure comedy and total combat chaos. Now sure, some doubts are still there, because this is a power that has to be handled carefully, balanced properly, and refined over time. In some moments, it's not that easy to fully understand how strong Luffy actually is, and the Looney Tunes effect can also risk becoming repetitive if overused. But even with that, this is still one of the most innovative power-ups ever introduced in the series. The reason the world government hid the fruit's true name behind the Gomu Gomu no Mi is simple. It's danger. Because this fruit is tied to the power that once belonged to Joy Boy, the world government's #1 enemy. At its base level, it gives the user the properties of rubber. But once awakened, everything changes. The user gains almost complete freedom in combat, taking on the form of the sun god Nika. He can even interact with intangible things like lightning, and he can turn the environment around him into rubber. And that's exactly why the Five Elders described it as the most ridiculous power in existence. And right after the craziest fruit of them all, we move to a category that's still a huge question mark. Logias. This is basically an extra slot on the list because, as of now, there's still no official confirmation that a Logia-type fruit can actually awaken. But there are definitely signs that suggest it might be possible. After all, we've seen that some Paramecia awakenings let the user affect the surrounding environment and transform it into their element. So it's more than fair to assume that at least some Logias might be capable of doing something similar. The three biggest suspects are the Magu Megu, the Hichehi, and the Suna Suna, which means the fruits of Sakazuki, Kuzan, and Crocodile. For Sakazuki and Kuzan, we already have a massive clue. Their battle on Punk Hazard permanently changed the island's climate and environment. In Crocodile's case, though, things get even more interesting. During one of his fights with Luffy and Alabasta, he turned statues into sand. His explanation is that through sand, he can remove moisture from the things he touches. But there's one important detail here. Back then, the concept of awakening hadn't been explicitly introduced yet. So it's entirely possible that what we saw was a kind of proto-awakening. Sort of like how mantra existed before it was formally defined as haki. Now let's get back to the confirmed awakenings, and let's jump into one of the most talked about fruits in all of One Piece. The Ope Ope no Mai of Trafalgar D. Waterlaw. We're talking about a fruit that by itself has sparked years of discussion. And honestly, for good reason. The Ope Ope no Mi allows Law to create rooms, spaces in which he can manipulate basically anything. Even people's personalities. Once he reaches awakening, as we saw in the fight against Big Mom, Law uses a bubble called Kroom, which coats his sword. At that point, the blade can pass through the target without damaging them externally. But the real damage comes from the inside, because Kroom generates a devastating electric shockwave that deals massive internal damage. The peak of this power is Puncture Will, a technique where the sword extends for miles, and once it reaches maximum length, Law unleashes an insanely powerful shockwave through it. Big Mom definitely felt that one. And staying in Onigashima, we move on to his ally rival, the Jiki Jiki no Mi of Eustace Captain Kidd. May he rest in peace. We first saw this fruit back at the Sabaody Archipelago, but it's really in Wano where we get to understand just how far it can go. The Jiki Jiki no Mi lets Kidd manipulate magnetic forces at will, attracting and repelling the metal around him. With that power, he can basically turn his body into a magnetic core and enhance himself with massive metal constructs. With Awakening, Kidd gains the ability called Assign, And this is where things get really interesting, because with a sign he can give magnetic properties to other targets, even to people. And he manages to do that to Big Mom, not to some random Marine, not to some CP0 agent, to Big Mom. Now let's take another step back and return to the parameshas, because there are two more major ones we need to talk about. Let's start with Don Quixote do Flamingo and the Ito Ito no Mi. The former warlord, former king of Dressrosa, and current inmate can use this fruit to create strings at will and manipulate both people and objects. Once the fruit awakens, things go to another level. Do Flamingo can turn the surrounding environment into strings and control it freely. The principle is very similar to what we also see with other fruits. The power stops being limited to the user's body and starts extending into the world around them. Although, to be fair, against Luffy, this awakening didn't end up being decisive. And right after Doflamingo, there's another paramecia that absolutely belongs on this list, the Mochi Mochi no Mi of Katakuri. Actually, more than just a normal paramecia, this is what Oda himself called a special paramecia. And it's special because it's the only fruit in that category that allows the user to create, control, and even transform into their own element, Mochi. So in some ways, it almost works like a Logia. Katakuri's awakening, shown during Whole Cake Island, allows him to extend his power into the surrounding environment. And in his fight against Luffy, that gives him a huge advantage, overwhelming him with attacks and putting him under pressure for most of the battle. From there, we move back to the Zoans, and we start with one of CP0's most recognizable faces, Rob Lucci with the Neko Neko no Mi, model leopard. We've known this fruit since Enies Lobby. It lets him transform into a giant leopard and into his hybrid form, which is also the form where he brings out his full fighting strength. At Egghead during the fight against Luffy, Lucci reveals his awakening almost immediately. Probably out of caution, probably out of pride, probably also because he wanted to make an entrance. The problem is, that entrance backfires on him really fast, because he gets completely wrecked. That said, the awakening still clearly shows its benefits. Lucci recovers quickly, becomes faster, stronger, more aggressive, and overall more effective during the fight against Gear 5th Luffy. Even visually, the change is obvious. A thicker mane, the classic flames, and a leaner body. Right after Lucci, we get his co-worker, Kaku with the Ushi Ushi no Mi model giraffe. In this case too, we actually saw the moment he ate the fruit back in Enies Lobby. Its power lets him transform into a giraffe and into a hybrid form. At first, Kaku still seemed pretty inexperienced with the fruit, but by Egghead, things are very different, and we see that he's improved enough to unlock Awakening. That Awakening gives him the classic flames, but more importantly, a major boost in strength, speed, endurance, and recovery. In fact, after getting knocked out by Zoro, he comes back into action very quickly and starts fighting again. That alone makes him one of the strongest members of CP0. Of course, there's still the small detail that we're talking about, an organization that also has the honor of losing to Aizo's little pistols. But still, let's at least give Kaku that win. And finally, to close the circle, we go back to the very first time One Piece introduced us to the concept of awakening, the Jailer Beasts of Impel Down. Here we're not talking about one specific fruit, but a group of awakened Zoans. And it's through them that One Piece first introduces this whole idea. What makes these Zoans unique is that they seem to have completely taken over their hosts, leaving them unconscious. Their main trait is overwhelming strength and absurd durability. The problem is that we know too little to fully analyze them. We don't know who ate those fruits, we don't know how their base forms worked, and because of that, it's hard to measure exactly how dangerous they really were. Still, there is one clue that helps put them into perspective. They were under Sadie's command, and in the hierarchy she ranks below both Magellan and Hannibal. And that suggests that, as impressive as they looked, they were still relatively weak opponents overall. So yeah, when you put all these cases together, the bigger picture starts becoming pretty clear. Devil Fruit Awakening isn't just a simple power-up. It's a true evolution of the bond between the user and the fruit. Sometimes it boosts physical stats, sometimes it extends the power into the environment, and sometimes it completely changes the way that power is perceived. And that's exactly why it remains one of the most fascinating elements in all of One Piece. With that said, let me know in the comments which other fruits you think could awaken before the end of the series. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. I'll see you in the next video.